Imagine this, a sunny afternoon in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where everything looks picture perfect on the outside. Our story begins in a chic little flower shop, nestled on a quiet street, known for its stunning floral arrangements and devoted local clientele. The shop is run by a hardworking florist, let's call her Lily, who pours her heart and soul into every bouquet she creates. It's not just a business for her, it's her passion. One day, a woman walks in, and from the moment she steps through the door, you can tell she's wealthy. Everything about her screams high society, the designer handbag, the perfectly tailored clothes, and the air of entitlement she carries with her. Let's call her Mrs. Thompson. She's one of those regular customers who always demands the best, and usually, money isn't an issue. But today, something's different. Mrs. Thompson approaches the counter with a frosty smile. "I ordered an arrangement last week for my event," she says, her voice dripping with impatience. Lily, always eager to please, quickly nods and retrieves the record of the sale. She knows exactly which order Mrs. Thompson is referring to, a grand arrangement full of rare and exotic blooms. It was one of her finest works. But before Lily can say another word, Mrs. Thompson's expression hardens. "There's a problem," she says, her voice cold. "I believe some of my personal items were stolen." Lily's heart skips a beat. Stolen? Personal items? The words don't make sense. Florists don't deal with personal belongings. All they handle are flowers, orders, and deliveries. Mrs. Thompson explains that some valuable jewelry went missing shortly after the delivery was made. And now, she's insinuating that Lily, or one of her employees, is responsible. Lily is stunned. She has always prided herself on being honest and trustworthy, building relationships with her customers based on integrity. Accusations like this don't just hurt, they're devastating, especially coming from someone as influential as Mrs. Thompson. If word of this spreads, it could ruin her business. Mrs. Thompson isn't backing down. She's demanding an investigation, and she's not being subtle about how serious this accusation is. She threatens to involve the authorities, confident in her wealth and power, to get to the bottom of things. But here's where the story takes a twist. Lily knows something Mrs. Thompson doesn't. And as the pieces of this puzzle start to come together, it becomes clear that there's much more at play here than a missing piece of jewelry. Secrets begin to surface, secrets that could turn this entire accusation on its head. As the tension rises, you can't help but wonder, who's telling the truth? Is Lily the victim of a wealthy woman's unjust power play? Or is there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Stay tuned, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about this story. And trust me, the truth will shock you. As Lily stands behind the counter, trying to keep her composure, her mind races. How could Mrs. Thompson accuse her of something so outlandish? She's always been careful, ensuring every transaction is smooth, every customer is happy. And besides, her business is all about flowers, not personal items, not jewelry. The very idea of it feels absurd. But then she glances at Mrs. Thompson, who is standing there with a look of unwavering confidence, and something in Lily stirs. It's not just the accusation, it's the way Mrs. Thompson seems so sure of herself, as if her word alone could bring down everything Lily has worked for. There's power in that kind of wealth, and Mrs. Thompson knows it. But Lily, though shaken, isn't about to fold so easily. "I'm sorry you've lost something valuable," Lily says, keeping her voice as calm as she can manage. "But we only delivered flowers. We've never handled anything other than your order." Mrs. Thompson narrows her eyes, as though she doesn't believe a word. "The timing is suspicious," she replies. "My jewelry was right there on the table where the flowers were placed, and now it's gone. I'm not saying it was you, but you should really look into your staff." Lily feels her stomach turn. Her staff? There are only 2 others who work at the shop, both of whom have been with her for years. They're like family. The thought of them being accused is just as painful as being accused herself. But Mrs. Thompson doesn't seem to care about the human cost of her words. She's focused only on her missing items. After Mrs. Thompson leaves, promising to take further action if the situation isn't resolved, Lily is left in the quiet of the shop, her thoughts spinning. She knows she needs to talk to her employees, but the very idea makes her anxious. How do you even begin to ask people you trust about something like this? But if she doesn't, Mrs. Thompson could go public with her accusation, and that could destroy everything. The next day, when her two employees Rachel and David arrive for their shifts, Lily pulls them aside. Both of them look concerned when they hear what happened, especially Rachel, who had delivered the flowers to Mrs. Thompson's house. "I remember that delivery," Rachel says, her voice tight. "It was a big order, and she wasn't home, so I just left the flowers in the foyer like we always do. There was a housekeeper who let me in, but I didn't even go past the front room. I was in and out in 5 minutes." Lily watches Rachel's face closely. She knows Rachel wouldn't steal, but this whole situation is so confusing. If Rachel didn't take the jewelry, then who did? The housekeeper? Someone else in the house? Or is it possible that Mrs. Thompson misplaced it and is looking for someone to blame? David, who helps manage the shop, suggests they reach out to Mrs. Thompson and ask for more details. Maybe there's a misunderstanding, but Lily's not so sure. Mrs. Thompson seemed determined to pin the blame on the shop, and reaching out might just give her more fuel for her accusations. Still, David's idea lingers in Lily's mind. What if there is a way to clear this up quickly, before it blows out of proportion? She decides to give Mrs. Thompson a call, hoping for a civil conversation. But when Mrs. Thompson answers, her tone is sharp, almost hostile. "I've already spoken with my lawyer," she says, before Lily can even explain why she's calling. "If you don't want this to become a bigger issue, I suggest you find out what happened." Lily's heart sinks. This is more serious than she realized. A lawyer? What started as a vague accusation is quickly spiraling into something much bigger. As she hangs up the phone, she feels the weight of it all pressing down on her. She doesn't know what to do next. Days pass, and the tension in the shop is palpable. Rachel is anxious, constantly checking the shop's reviews online to see if anyone has mentioned the incident. David tries to keep everyone calm, but even he's starting to feel the strain. Every time the phone rings, Lily's heart jumps, wondering if it's another angry call from Mrs. Thompson or worse, a lawyer. One afternoon, just when Lily thinks things can't get any worse, a detective shows up at the shop. He's polite, professional, but the very sight of him sends a chill through Lily. He explains that Mrs. Thompson has filed a report, and now he has to follow up on the claim. Lily explains everything as best she can, the delivery, the fact that none of her staff would ever do such a thing, but the detective's neutral expression doesn't give anything away. He takes notes, asks questions, and before leaving, he politely suggests that Lily cooperate fully with the investigation. The investigation. Those words stick in her mind. It feels so surreal. Just a week ago, everything was normal. Now, her business, her reputation is under threat. And the worst part is, she has no idea how to stop it. As the days go on, the investigation looms over everything. Customers start asking questions, some of them curious, others more concerned. Word of the incident is starting to spread. And while Mrs. Thompson hasn't gone public yet, it's clear that people are talking. Lily can feel her once loyal customers becoming hesitant, unsure if they can trust the shop anymore. But something doesn't sit right with Lily. The more she thinks about it, the more the pieces don't add up. Mrs. Thompson is wealthy, influential, and used to getting what she wants. Could this really just be about a missing piece of jewelry? Or is there something else going on? Lily starts to do a little digging on her own, asking around discreetly. She learns that Mrs. Thompson has a reputation in the community, not just for her wealth, but for her temper. People whisper about her, behind her back, sharing stories of how she's made life difficult for others, how she's used her influence to get her way in the past. The more Lily uncovers, the more she begins to wonder, could this be a power move? Is Mrs. Thompson using her position to manipulate the situation for reasons that have nothing to do with the missing jewelry? Lily's thoughts are interrupted one morning when she receives an anonymous note in the mail. The note is short, just a few lines, but it sends a shiver down her spine. It reads, "Be careful who you trust. Not everything is as it seems." The note leaves Lily with more questions than answers. Who sent it? What does it mean? And most importantly, how does it fit into everything that's been happening? The mystery deepens, and with each passing day, the pressure on Lily grows. She's determined to get to the bottom of this to clear her name and protect her business. But with Mrs. Thompson's influence, the ongoing investigation, and now this cryptic note, it feels like the odds are stacked against her. One thing is clear, the truth is still out there, hidden beneath layers of deception. And as Lily gets closer to uncovering it, she realizes that the answers might be more shocking than she ever could have imagined. Lily couldn't stop thinking about the anonymous note. Its cryptic message haunted her. Be careful who you trust. The words echoed in her mind as she stood in the shop, trying to focus on the day's orders. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the mystery surrounding Mrs. Thompson's accusations. The note had rattled her in ways she hadn't expected. It suggested that someone else knew something important. But who? And why would they send it anonymously? As she stared at the flowers in front of her, her hands moving almost mechanically, arranging stems and blossoms, her mind kept circling the same questions. Could Rachel or David really know more than they were letting on? It seemed impossible she trusted them completely. But that trust had been shaken, ever so slightly, ever since Mrs. Thompson's accusations had thrown everything into chaos. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation dragged on. Every time a customer walked through the door, Lily wondered if they had heard the rumors. She could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced around, as if searching for clues to confirm the whispers that had been circulating. Business was starting to suffer. Regulars weren't coming in as often, and new customers seemed hesitant, unsure if they could trust the shop with their orders. It was a slow, creeping kind of disaster, one that Lily could feel unfolding, but couldn't stop. The tension between her and her employees was growing too. Rachel was quieter than usual, her normally cheerful attitude dulled by the weight of the accusation hanging over the shop. David, ever the problem solver, tried to keep things light, but even he couldn't hide the strain. They all felt it, the unspoken tension that made the air thick, the way they avoided certain conversations, the growing fear that everything they had worked for was slipping away. One evening, after closing the shop, Lily sat at her desk, staring at the financial reports. The numbers were grim. If things didn't turn around soon, she wasn't sure how long she could keep the business afloat. Her mind was buzzing with thoughts when the phone rang, breaking the silence. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. On the other end was a voice low, almost hesitant. It was the housekeeper from Mrs. Thompson's house, the one who had let Rachel in during the delivery. Her voice wavered as she spoke, like someone carrying a heavy secret. "I've been wanting to reach out," the housekeeper said. "I don't know who to trust, but I thought you should know things aren't what they seem." Lily's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she asked, gripping the phone tighter. The housekeeper hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw something the day of the delivery. Something I'm not sure I should talk about. But I can't keep quiet anymore. You're being blamed for something that has nothing to do with you." Lily's pulse quickened. "What did you see?" There was a long pause before the housekeeper continued. After Rachel left, Mrs. Thompson wasn't happy with the flowers. She was upset. She threw them across the room, like she always does when things don't go her way. But then she did something strange. She started yelling about her missing jewelry, but no one else had been in the house except her and I. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. The housekeeper was saying what she had been dreading all along. This wasn't about the flowers or the delivery. It was something much deeper, something Mrs. Thompson had orchestrated. But why? Was she trying to frame Lily to cover up something else? Was this just another display of power? A way to manipulate the situation to her advantage? "I can't prove anything," the housekeeper continued, her voice shaky, "but I've seen her do things like this before. She gets angry, and when things don't go her way, she lashes out. But this time, it feels different. I think she's hiding something." Lily sat in stunned silence, her mind racing with the possibilities. She thanked the housekeeper and hung up, but the conversation left her more anxious than ever. The pieces were starting to come together, but they didn't paint a clear picture yet. All Lily knew for sure was that Mrs. Thompson wasn't telling the truth. But proving that, especially against someone with her influence, seemed impossible. The next day, Lily couldn't shake feeling that she was being watched. Every glance from a customer, every passing look from someone on the street, felt like a judgment. Even David and Rachel seemed more distant, as if they were waiting for something to happen, for the final blow to land. That afternoon, Mrs. Thompson made a surprise visit to the shop. She walked in with the same air of superiority, her head held high, her eyes scanning the place like she owned it. Lily's stomach twisted in knots as she approached the counter. "I thought I'd stop by to see if there's been any progress," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The authorities seem to be moving rather slowly, don't they?" Lily swallowed her anger, forcing a polite smile. "We're cooperating fully, as I'm sure you know." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smirk playing at her lips. "Of course you are. But I do hope this is resolved soon. My patience is wearing thin." There was something in her tone, something smug and confident, as though she already knew how this would end. Lily felt a surge of frustration. This woman had the power to ruin her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it, at least not yet. As Mrs. Thompson turned to leave, she paused at the door and looked over her shoulder. "Oh, and Lily, be careful who you trust." The words sent a chill down Lily's spine, echoing the anonymous note she had received. Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered for a moment longer before she walked out, leaving Lily feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, Lily couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Why had Mrs. Thompson said those words? Was it just a coincidence, or was she involved with the note? And if she was, what did that mean for investigation? The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and suspicion. The tension between Lily, Rachel, and David reached a breaking point. Rachel, in particular, seemed on edge, snapping at customers and avoiding eye contact with Lily. It was unlike her, and Lily couldn't help but wonder if the stress of the situation was starting to get to her. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning, while going through the shop's emails, Lily came across a message from a private investigator, someone who had been quietly looking into Mrs. Thompson's background. The email was brief, but its content sent a shockwave through Lily. The investigator had uncovered something startling. Mrs. Thompson's finances weren't as secure as they appeared. In fact, she was deeply in debt, her extravagant lifestyle crumbling behind the scenes. Suddenly, everything clicked. The missing jewelry, the accusations, the lawyer's threats, it was all starting to make sense. Mrs. Thompson was in trouble, and she needed a scapegoat, someone to divert attention from her crumbling facade. And who better to blame than a small business owner who couldn't fight back? Lily's hands trembled as she read the email over and over, the pieces finally falling into place. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just accusing her of theft, she was trying to cover up her own downfall, using Lily and her shop as a way to distract from her financial ruin. But now that Lily knew the truth, what could she do about it? Mrs. Thompson was powerful, connected, and still had the upper hand. If Lily confronted her directly, it could backfire, and the investigation was still ongoing. The stakes had never been higher, and danger was growing with each passing day. As Lily stood in the empty shop, the weight of everything pressing down on her, she knew she had reached most critical moment. The truth was within reach, but exposing it could come at a cost. She had to decide, would she play it safe, or would she risk everything to bring Mrs. Thompson's secrets to light? With her business, her reputation, and her future hanging in the balance, Lily knew one thing for certain: the next move would determine everything. And the truth, no matter how dangerous, was about to be revealed. Lily sat at her desk, staring at the email from the private investigator, her heart racing. The truth about Mrs. Thompson's financial ruin was staring her in the face. It all made sense now, why the wealthy woman had been so eager to accuse her of theft, why she had been so quick to get lawyers involved. Mrs. Thompson needed an escape, and Lily had unwittingly become the perfect scapegoat. But just as Lily was piecing it all together, something strange happened. The shop's front door chimed, announcing the arrival of a customer. It was late in the evening, and she wasn't expecting anyone. As the door creaked open, a figure stepped inside, casting a long shadow across the room. It was a man, and he looked out of place in the otherwise quiet floral setting of the shop. His clothes were dark, his face partially obscured by a hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had been so consumed by the growing conflict with Mrs. Thompson that she hadn't noticed how the world around her was shifting. The man's presence felt like a new threat, something she hadn't prepared for. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but she couldn't tell if this stranger was friend or foe. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though she could feel the tension building in her chest. The man didn't respond at first. He simply stood there, eyes locked on her, as though he were weighing whether or not to speak. Finally, he pulled the hat from his head, revealing a sharp, cold stare. His voice was low and gravelly when he finally spoke. "I know what's going on with Mrs. Thompson," he said, his words hanging in the air like a threat. Lily's blood ran cold. How could this man know? She hadn't told anyone about the email or her suspicions about Mrs. Thompson's motives. Was he part of Mrs. Thompson's plan? Was this some kind of intimidation tactic? The man took a step closer. "I wouldn't be so quick to trust your sources," he warned. "There's more going on here than you realize. If you think Mrs. Thompson is the only one with something to hide, you're mistaken." Lily frowned, her mind racing. What did he mean? Was there another player involved in this mess? And why was this stranger so confident that she would listen to him? He seemed to sense her hesitation and held up a small, crumpled envelope, one that looked like it had been passed around a few times. "You're not the only one she's been manipulating," he said, handing it to her. Against her better judgment, Lily took the envelope, her hands trembling as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the writing on it barely legible. As she read, her eyes widened in disbelief. The note was a series of instructions, someone's plan to undermine Mrs. Thompson's carefully crafted image. But it wasn't just a plan to accuse Lily of theft, it was much bigger than that. The paper mentioned a secret deal, one that Mrs. Thompson had struck with a third party, someone powerful, someone who wasn't just about to let their reputation be destroyed by a simple accusation. The note hinted at blackmail, backdoor negotiations, and a hidden agenda that reached far beyond the flower shop and its owner. Lily's heart raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Was this man really trying to help her? Or was he simply another pawn in a far more dangerous game? Before she could ask, the man turned to leave, glancing back over his shoulder. "You're running out of time," he said cryptically. "The truth is buried, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find it. Just make sure you know who you're really dealing with before it's too late." And then he was gone, swallowed by the night. Lily stood there, holding the crumpled envelope, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and her mind was spinning. If Mrs. Thompson was involved in some kind of backdoor deal, what did that mean for her? Was Mrs. Thompson's financial ruin part of something bigger? And why had this stranger shown up in her shop with this cryptic warning? As she stood there in the dim light of the shop, her thoughts started to piece together. The deeper she dug into Mrs. Thompson's life, the more questions arose. The missing jewelry was no longer just about a stolen item. It was the tip of the iceberg, pointing to something much more sinister. There were layers to this situation, layers that even Lily hadn't been able to see until now. And just as the mystery seemed to deepen, another unexpected twist hit her: an email notification. It was from her private investigator. She opened it quickly, her fingers trembling as she clicked on the attachment. What she saw made her blood run cold. The investigator had discovered something shocking about Mrs. Thompson's lawyer, the one who had been threatening to sue Lily, and who had been pushing the police to investigate. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was part of a larger network of legal professionals involved in high-stakes financial fraud. The investigator had linked the lawyer to a string of shady cases, all involving wealthy clients using false accusations to cover up illegal activities. Lily's head spun. The lawyer wasn't just working for Mrs. Thompson, he had his own interests in this, and he had been trying to set up Lily all along, knowing full well that his client's situation was a losing battle. Mrs. Thompson's wealth wasn't just being drained by poor investments or bad decisions, it was being siphoned off by a web of deceit and manipulation, one that stretched far wider than Lily could have imagined. Everything was connected, from the missing jewelry to the strange man's warning, to the lawyer's questionable practices. This wasn't just about a wealthy woman trying to save face. This was a network of corruption that had likely been operating for years. The more Lily thought about it, the more she realized how dangerous this situation had become. Not only was Mrs. Thompson a puppet in this bigger scheme, But she was also just one part of a much larger puzzle. If Lily exposed the truth about the lawyer and the fraudulent activities, it wouldn't just take down Mrs. Thompson. It would expose a criminal enterprise that had been preying on the wealthy and powerful for years. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the risks. Lily knew she was in over her head. She couldn't handle this alone, and with the police investigation still ongoing, she had to decide whether to take a leap of faith and trust this mysterious stranger's warning, or to continue playing along with Mrs. Thompson's game, hoping for an end that might never come. Her options were dwindling, and every move she made seemed to put her closer to a dangerous truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As she stood there in the stillness of her shop, the weight of everything pressing down on her, Lily knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a fight to clear her name. It was a battle to survive in a world where nothing was as it seemed, and no one could be trusted. The days had stretched on, the weight of uncertainty dragging Lily down further and further. But as the pressure mounted, she knew she couldn't run from it anymore. The truth was out there somewhere, buried beneath lies, manipulation, and hidden agendas, and it was up to her to bring it to light. The game had changed, and she was no longer just a florist caught in a scandal. She was a fighter, armed with the knowledge that this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing a network of corruption that could bring powerful people to their knees. It was late evening when Lily received the call from the private investigator. He had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, following leads, digging into the lawyer's connections, and uncovering everything that had been carefully concealed. This was it, the breakthrough she had been waiting for. "I've got something," he said, his voice crackling over the phone. "Meet me at the office in an hour. You need to see this." Her heart raced as she quickly gathered her things and headed out the door. She didn't have time to second-guess her decision. Every moment that passed only brought more danger, and the more she learned, the more she realized how deep the rabbit hole went. When she arrived at the investigator's office, he was waiting for her, his face drawn and serious. He gestured for her to sit and handed her a thick stack of papers. "Mrs. Thompson wasn't just in financial trouble," he said, his voice low. "There's an entire operation happening behind the scenes. This lawyer of hers, the one who's been trying to frame you, is a part of a criminal syndicate that's been laundering money for years. They've been using their clients to hide illegal activities." Lily's eyes widened as she flipped through the papers. Each document revealed a tangled web of transactions, secret accounts, and offshore investments. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only wealthy person caught up in this. There were dozens of names, all with links to shady dealings and fraudulent business practices. "And the lawyer?" Lily asked, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "He's been using her to cover up his own crimes." "Exactly," the investigator confirmed. "And that's not all. The man you met who gave you that envelope, he's not just an ordinary person. He's one of the key players in this syndicate, working from the shadows. His warning wasn't to protect you, it was to scare you into silence. He doesn't want the truth to come out." Lily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been so sure that the mysterious man was trying to help her, but now it seemed he had been manipulating her from the very beginning. Her instincts had been right all along. There were far more dangerous people involved than she had realized. But then something clicked in her mind. The housekeeper's words, the missing jewelry, the lies, everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Mrs. Thompson had been a pawn, just like Lily. They were both being used to cover up a much bigger operation. But who was behind it all? And why had Mrs. Thompson turned on her so quickly? As she stared at the stack of papers, her mind raced with possibilities. She couldn't stop now. The truth was within her grasp, but time was running out. Suddenly, the investigator's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face turning pale. "We need to go," he said, standing abruptly. "They're on to us." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she followed him out of the office and into the dark streets. She didn't know who they were, but she could feel the danger closing in around them. The investigator had been working for months to gather evidence, but now it seemed like their time had run out. As they hurried down the alley behind the office, Lily's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know you're getting close. If you want to stay safe, stop digging." Now, Lily's pulse quickened. Whoever had sent the message knew everything about her, The investigation, the lawyer, the syndicate. They had been watching her from the start. "Don't respond," the investigator said, pulling her along faster. "It's too dangerous now." But Lily wasn't listening. She couldn't stop. Not when everything she had worked for was on the line. Not when she had the chance to expose the truth. As they rounded a corner, they were met by the same man who had given her the mysterious envelope, the one who had warned her to be careful. But this time, there was no cryptic warning. There was no vague threat. This time, he was holding a gun. Lily froze, her heart racing as the man's cold eyes locked onto her. "You've come too far," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed out of it, Lily. Now, you're a liability." She glanced at the investigator, who looked just as terrified as she felt. But there was no way out now. No turning back. She had to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. The man's smile was cruel. "I want you to stop. I want you to forget everything you've seen and heard. Because if you don't, things will get worse. For you, and for everyone around you." Lily's mind was racing. She couldn't give in, not now, not after everything she had uncovered. But with the gun in his hand, she couldn't see a way out. Her instincts told her to run, but she knew that wasn't an option either. Just as the man took a step closer, the investigator suddenly lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. The two men struggled, and in the chaos, the gun skidded across the pavement, out of reach. Lily took a step back, her heart pounding in her ears. The struggle between the men was intense, but she knew it wouldn't last long. If she didn't act now, she would lose her chance to expose the truth. In a flash of inspiration, Lily reached into her bag and pulled out the papers the investigator had given her. She held them high, her voice loud and desperate. "I have everything," she shouted. "All of it. The proof. The money laundering. The lawyer's involvement. I'll go to the police. I'll go to the media. You can't stop me." "I know you're digging into things, Lily," Mrs. Thompson's voice crackled through the phone. "But if you want to save yourself, you need to stop. You have no idea what you're up against." Lily clenched her fists. This wasn't just about the florist anymore. It wasn't about Mrs. Thompson or the lawyer. It was about the powerful forces that had been manipulating her from the beginning. She had to end this, once and for all. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The police launched an investigation into the criminal syndicate, and soon, more details began to surface. The lawyer, who'd been the main player in Mrs. Thompson's case, had a long history of shady dealings. He was connected to a larger group of individuals involved in financial fraud, money laundering, and even more sinister activities. But it wasn't just the lawyer who was involved. The deeper the investigation went, the more names came to light. There were prominent business people, politicians, and even a few high-profile celebrities whose names were linked to the syndicate's illegal activities. It was clear now that this wasn't just a local issue, it was a nationwide conspiracy. Lily watched as the news spread across media outlets. The story was blowing up, and soon, reporters were knocking on her door. She was no longer just the woman accused of theft, she was the key whistleblower in a massive financial scandal. It was overwhelming. But as the pieces fell into place, Lily realized how much stronger she had become. She had been through so much, and yet she hadn't given up. She had fought back against the lies and the manipulation, and now, the truth was being exposed. But there was still one question that haunted her. Where was the man with the gun? Had he been part of the syndicate all along? And what had he meant when he said that the real mastermind was still out there, watching her? Weeks passed, and the investigation continued. More people were arrested, and the full extent of the syndicate's activities was revealed. But as the police closed in on the final suspects, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Then one night, she received another unexpected message, a text, from the same unknown number that had been sending her threats. "You've done well, Lily, but you'll never know the full truth." The message sent a chill down her spine. What did that mean? She had uncovered so much already, and yet, there was still more to the story. The final piece was still out of reach. Just when she thought she had uncovered everything, another twist came. The police had found something hidden in a secret compartment inside the lawyer's office. It was a file, one that contained a list of names and addresses. At first glance, it seemed like just another list of contacts. But when they began to dig deeper, they realized it was a list of people involved in the syndicate's operations, including a number of high-ranking officials in law enforcement and government. The realization hit like a punch in the gut. The corruption ran deeper than they had ever imagined. The syndicate wasn't just hiding behind powerful people, it was embedded within the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like her. As the police connected the dots, Lily realized that the man with the gun had been right all along. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt lawyer. It was about exposing a system that had been rigged from the inside out. The final twist came when they arrested the head of the syndicate, none other than a well-known businessman who had been a trusted friend of Mrs. Thompson. He had been pulling the strings all along, using his connections to cover up his crimes and maintain his influence over the legal system. Lily couldn't believe it. The man who had been sending her threats, the man who had warned her to stop digging, he was just another pawn in a much larger game. The real mastermind had been right under her nose the entire time. As the dust settled and the police closed in on the last few suspects, Lily realized that this was the end of the road for her. She had fought hard, uncovered the truth, and survived the threats and danger. But now, as the story came to a close, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had taken down the corrupt syndicate, exposed the lies, and found justice for herself and the others who had been affected. And yet, despite everything, there was still a nagging feeling that would never quite go away, that the real work wasn't over. The fight for truth, she realized, was never truly finished. There would always be new challenges, new conspiracies, new lies to uncover. But for now, she could finally rest knowing that she had made a difference. She had stood up, faced the danger, and come out victorious. The lesson was clear: no matter how deep the corruption runs, the truth will always find a way to the surface.